This is a rare public glimpse of an essentially private woman, Sister Nicholas, receiving an inscribed tray last weekend as the Clare person of 1986. Ironically, many of those who've been given a future, a new lease of life, are those who've never seen her face or heard her voice, and yet they know her better than perhaps their own parents. For some of those afflicted with deafness also carry the burden of being born or later becoming blind, either through disease or congenital disorder. Through her hands and the hands she has trained during the last 50 years, the blind can see a world that would otherwise be in total darkness and hear about its happenings in a life devoid of all sound. These people carry not just the white stick of the blind, but the red bands indicating deafness also. Born in Ennis in 1916, Sister Nicholas has devoted her life to caring for the afflicted, but it was a dedication that evolved as if predestined.
It really is an extraordinary way, the way I became involved. When I was 14 years of age, I made up my mind that I would be a nun. I never thought of the work I was going to do, and indeed the congregation which I was going to enter. My mother sent me to a boarding school in Dublin in the hope that, being away from home, I would be in a better position to make up my mind. Eventually, when I sat for leaving certificate, I decided I would be a nun. And I entered the Dominican convent at Cabra. And in Cabra, there is a famous school for the deaf. And I was sent over there to observe. And that's really how I became involved in the work for the deaf. I was fascinated right from the start.
What were the attitudes then to the deaf?
Deafness is still a misunderstood handicap. But when I went to the school at Cabra, internationally that school was famous for the educational level which it had attained for deaf people. But at that time, the nuns were getting £15 a year to feed, clothe and teach a child, because there was no special education department in Ireland at the time. So the place, they were very, very poor, but the nuns were marvellous. They were very gifted people, very practical at the same time. And they were involved in what was virtually a hidden apostolate. Nobody in Ireland thought of the deaf. I hadn't met very many deaf people before I became a teacher, and a whole new world was opened up to me when I went there. Deafness, because I think of the sign language which the deaf used, at that time the deaf people were branded, as it were, and they were hidden away, literally hidden away. Now one can't blame the public altogether, because if you meet a parent with a deaf child and you communicate with the child and you get no response, the child is embarrassed, the parents are embarrassed, and you tend then to avoid that experience, both for yourself and for the parents. So the attitudes were quite different. There was no organisation at that time, which was I went there in 1934, there was no organisation helping the public to understand the problems of the deaf. That did not take place until the mid-60s, and then the National Association for the Deaf was set up.
But in real terms, have attitudes changed?
Yes, oh certainly they have. In the 30s, very few parents would learn sign language. It's not that easy. It has become easier because of the effect of seeing sign language on television. It has become more popular, let me say, and I think the stigma is less because you see more of sign language around the place at the present time. Also, when it came to vocational training, in Ireland when I started, the men were shoemakers, the girls were maids in hospitals or convents, they were dressmakers. And you can imagine the situation where there's somebody with a very, very high IQ who was well educated and was condemned to sweeping floors in a hospital. Now that has changed considerably because third level education has been made available to them, and you find deaf people, totally deaf people, who can lip read fairly well. They don't lip read every word, but fairly well. You find them in places like the ESB, Sugar Company, Aer Lingus and so on. And so I would say yes, attitudes have changed. There's more work to be done, but certainly there is a change.
Perhaps one of the saddest sights to the unprepared is that of children not only deprived of sight and sound, but also suffering from mental abnormality. But at the Dominican Schools for the Deaf, there's hope and help from Sister Nicholas and her colleagues.
She's 11, isn't she? I think they haven't thought in Ireland, they haven't thought much about deaf-blind people at all. Happily, they're few in number. But we do have children who, owing to rubella, are born deaf-blind and maybe mentally handicapped. The adult deaf-blind, many of the people that I see and many of the people that we have here in St. Joseph's are people who were born totally deaf with vision, were educated in sign language as sighted deaf people, and then in adolescence began to lose their sight, and now they are blind. And I don't think the people are really aware of them. And that's what I would like to do in my retirement, to help the public really to become aware of them.
The public is becoming aware of the need for practical help, as demonstrated by these pupils from Loreto Convent in Foxrock, who've made the effort to learn how to communicate with those who can't see or hear. Each week, they and students from another nearby school visit St. Joseph's to discuss anything from current affairs and politics to literature and clothing fashions, topics which, in years past, might have been unknown to people without two of the human senses. I wondered, despite her religious vocation and her 50 years of experience, did Sister Nicholas ever have feelings of the great inequity between those of us with sight and hearing and those without?
Yes, very often. For instance, when you are working with a child who has 5 handicaps, and perhaps there are problems in the home as well, you think there is great inequity. It's a mystery.
Does it make you question your faith?
Yes, at times, but I know that God loves us, and I know it is a mystery, and we will understand it eventually. And I've also seen families who've had handicapped children like that, and they did come to a stage when they could say that they were grateful to God for the handicapped child, in that it brought the family together. The children grew up unselfish because they were helping the handicapped child, and it created a real family feeling because everybody wanted to help that child.
Sister Nicholas, recognised and acclaimed for her work in this field in countries as far apart as Canada and Israel, and now looking back over 50 years of teaching and training and struggling to make the rest of us aware of the problems facing those handicapped by deafness, still retains her optimism and bubbling sense of humour. Sometimes I'm not called Sister Nicholas, she told me, just Old Nick. She speaks now of retirement, but because she has instilled that same optimism in generations of teachers and pupils, nobody really believes her. Is there something you'd like to say finally to people who are hard of hearing, who might be watching this programme right now?
I'm very glad to have this chance of sending greetings to my deaf friends in Ireland, especially to those who are sick and are housebound. I would like you too to send my greetings to the deaf-blind among you. God bless you all.